The Favored Son, Thal, Austria. 1947. When Arnold Schwarzenegger entered the world on July 30th, he arrived into a family already complete. His brother Meinhard, born exactly 1 year earlier, had claimed the position Arnold would spend his childhood trying to win, their father's favorite. Gustav Schwarzenegger, the local police chief, was a man forged by war and hardened by disappointment. He'd served in the Nazi military, not out of ideology, but necessity, and returned home carrying wounds both visible and hidden. His approach to fatherhood was militaristic, discipline through competition, love through criticism, affection withheld as motivation. Meinhard was everything Gustav valued: obedient, socially conventional, athletic in acceptable ways, ice curling, the respectable Austrian sport. He followed rules without question, pursued traditional paths without rebellion. To Gustav, Meinhard represented continuity, stability, the proper Austrian son. Arnold was different, louder, more ambitious. Obsessed with things Gustav considered frivolous: bodybuilding, American movies, impossible dreams. Where Meinhard accepted his place in Thal's social order, Arnold openly despised the limitations of small-town Austrian life. "My father made it very clear," Arnold later said in interviews, his voice carrying decades-old pain. Meinhard was the good son. I was the problem. But what looked like simple favoritism was actually more complex and more damaging. Gustav played his sons against each other deliberately, using comparison as a weapon. When Arnold achieved something, Gustav praised Meinhard's different achievement as superior. When Meinhard succeeded, Gustav reminded Arnold of his brother's victory. The brothers weren't allowed to be brothers. They were forced to be rivals. The competition Gustav invented: contests. Who could do more push-ups? Who could run faster? Who could endure pain longer without complaining? The winner received brief paternal approval. The loser got contempt and another reminder of his inadequacy. Arnold, being younger and naturally smaller, lost constantly in those early years. Each loss carved deeper into his psyche, building something that would later become his greatest weapon: an absolute refusal to accept defeat. But the competitions created a toxic dynamic between the brothers. Meinhard, naturally athletic and a year older, dominated physically. But he lacked Arnold's hunger, his obsessive drive to transcend limitations. Meinhard was content with local success. Arnold was already planning escape. Their mother, Aurelia, watched this psychological warfare with quiet devastation. She loved both sons equally, but was powerless to stop Gustav's manipulation. In the rigid gender dynamics of 1950s Austria, fathers controlled discipline and direction. Mothers provided comfort in the shadows. Aurelia tried to protect Arnold from his father's harshest judgments, which only made Gustav double down. Any maternal warmth toward Arnold was interpreted as weakness being encouraged. Gustav believed that life was brutal, and preparing Arnold for that brutality required crushing his spirit repeatedly until he either broke completely or became unbreakable. Arnold chose unbreakable. But the cost was a childhood spent feeling fundamentally unworthy of love unless he achieved something extraordinary. The divergence as teenagers, the brothers' paths split dramatically. Meinhard followed convention: reasonable athletic pursuits, preparation for respectable employment, integration into Thal's social fabric. He dated locally, drank with friends at the village pub, accepted his destiny as a small-town Austrian man. Arnold discovered bodybuilding at 15 and found something that changed everything. A competition where victory was objective, measurable, undeniable, no favoritism, no subjective judgment calls. Just muscle, symmetry, and determination measured on stage. More importantly, bodybuilding success offered an escape route from Austria. Arnold learned that champion bodybuilders could go to America, become movie stars, build wealth impossible in post-war Austria. This wasn't just a sport, it was a vehicle to a different life. Gustav hated it. Bodybuilding, to him, was narcissistic, homosexual, circus entertainment. Real men didn't parade around in small trunks flexing for applause. When Arnold won his first competition, Gustav didn't attend. When Arnold brought home trophies, Gustav barely acknowledged them. But something shifted. As Arnold's achievements accumulated regional champion, national champion, eventually junior Mr. Europe, even Gustav couldn't completely dismiss them. Arnold was becoming somebody. Not in ways Gustav approved of, but undeniably becoming somebody. Meinhard watched his younger brother's trajectory with complex emotions. Pride mixed with resentment. Happiness for Arnold's success, poisoned by awareness that he, the favored son, wasn't achieving anything equivalent. The competition their father had manufactured was producing a clear winner, and it wasn't Meinhard. Their relationship remained complicated, not hostile, but never quite brotherly. Too many years of forced rivalry had destroyed the possibility of simple affection. The separation Arnold left Austria for Munich, Germany, pursuing bigger bodybuilding opportunities and military service. Then, shockingly quickly, he started winning everything, Mr. Europe, Mr. Universe, by 1968. At age 21, he'd moved to America with dreams of becoming Mr. Olympia and breaking into Hollywood. Meinhard stayed in Austria. He'd married his girlfriend Erika, and they had a son, Patrick. He worked conventional jobs, lived in the region, embodied the traditional Austrian life their father had envisioned for both sons. But Meinhard was drinking heavily. Friends noticed increasing alcohol consumption, mood swings, suggestions of depression. Whether this stemmed from watching his younger brother achieve impossible dreams while he remained trapped in ordinariness, or from other demons, nobody could say with certainty. Arnold, meanwhile, was conquering America, winning Mr. Olympia in 1970, building real estate wealth, starring in Pumping Iron. Every achievement was a message back to Austria. I was right. The impossible wasn't impossible. You were all wrong about what I could become, but success created guilt. Arnold had escaped while Meinhard had stayed behind. Arnold was living the dreams while Meinhard lived the reality Gustav had prescribed. The favoritism hierarchy had inverted completely, and both brothers felt the disorientation of that reversal. They stayed in contact, but the conversations were strained. What do you say to the brother who has become everything you might have been if you had his courage to leave? The call, May 20th, 1971. Arnold was in Munich preparing for a bodybuilding competition when the phone rang. It was his mother, Aurelia, her voice shattered. Meinhard was dead. Car accident. He'd been drinking, lost control, crashed. 25 years old. Instant death. Arnold's reaction was complex in ways he'd spent decades trying to understand. Grief, certainly, but also something darker: relief, guilt about that relief, confusion about what he actually felt. Years later, Arnold would admit in therapy that part of him had been waiting for this call. Meinhard's drinking had been escalating. His life had seemed directionless, trapped. The accident felt less like shocking surprise and more like inevitable conclusion to a story that had been heading toward tragedy. But the guilt was crushing. Arnold had escaped. Arnold had pursued his dreams while Meinhard had stayed behind and slowly self-destructed. The favoritism that had tortured Arnold's childhood had ultimately destroyed the son who'd received it. Gustav had created two sons who couldn't both survive. One had to fail for the other to succeed. The competition had finally produced a definitive winner, but victory felt hollow and poisoned. The funeral decision: Arnold didn't attend Meinhard's funeral. This decision would haunt him for the rest of his life, becoming the single choice he'd reference most often when discussing regrets, failures, and psychological damage from his childhood. The official reason: he was competing in a bodybuilding contest that weekend. Contracts were signed. Obligations existed. Flying back to Austria would mean breaking commitments, disappointing sponsors, potentially damaging his career trajectory. But the real reasons were more complicated. Arnold later admitted he was terrified of confronting his grief publicly, of seeing his father's face, Of standing in that Austrian cemetery and being pulled back into the world he fought so desperately to escape. There was also something darker: anger. Anger at Meinhard for giving up, for not fighting harder, for letting alcohol and depression win. Arnold's entire psychology was built on willpower conquering limitation. Meinhard's death felt like capitulation, and Arnold didn't know how to process surrender. He competed that weekend. He won. Standing on stage holding a trophy while his brother was being buried felt simultaneously right and monstrously wrong. His mother never quite forgave him. She understood intellectually Arnold's career required sacrifice, but emotionally, she couldn't reconcile her son celebrating victory while his brother was lowered into the ground. Gustav's reaction was more complicated. Part of him seemed to respect Arnold's commitment to competition over sentiment. But part of him finally saw what his manufactured rivalry had produced. One son dead, the other so emotionally armored that he couldn't even mourn properly. The second death, July 1972. Barely a year after Meinhard's death, another phone call. Gustav Schwarzenegger had suffered a stroke. He was dying. This time, Arnold faced the same decision with different stakes. His father, the man who'd tormented him, dismissed his dreams, pitted him against his brother, yet also driven him to achieve impossible things through sheer refusal to accept his son as worthy. Arnold didn't go. Again, career obligations were cited. But again, the real reasons were psychological. He couldn't face his father's deathbed. Couldn't risk that final conversation where Gustav might ask forgiveness or, worse, might not. Arnold's relationship with his father was built on proving him wrong through achievement. Actually confronting the human being behind the harsh expectations was too dangerous. Gustav died without Arnold present, without reconciliation, without resolution. 2 funerals missed, 2 permanent wounds that would never fully heal. The psychological aftermath. For years, Arnold buried the trauma under relentless achievement. He became Mr. Olympia 7 times. Became Hollywood's biggest action star. Built business empires. Got married, had children. The forward momentum made thinking about Meinhard and Gustav unnecessary. But psychology doesn't work that way. Unprocessed grief doesn't disappear, it transforms into other symptoms. Arnold's emotional unavailability in relationships, the same quality that would later contribute to his marriage collapse, had roots in this childhood trauma. He'd learned that emotional connection was dangerous, that vulnerability was weakness, that the only safe response to pain was achievement and forward motion. His obsessive work ethic, while productive, was also avoidance. As long as he was training, filming, building, competing, he didn't have to sit with the knowledge that his brother had died while he'd been pursuing trophies, that his father had died without them ever understanding each other. The affair with Mildred Bena, the systematic deception, these weren't disconnected from his childhood either. Arnold had learned compartmentalization as survival strategy. Gustav had taught him to separate his authentic self from his performing self. The same skill that made him a great actor enabled him to maintain completely separate realities in his personal life. The reckoning, it took decades, but eventually Arnold confronted what he'd spent his adult life avoiding. Therapy after his marriage collapsed forced examination of patterns he'd never questioned. He talked about Meinhard publicly for the first time in his autobiography, describing the complicated mix of love, rivalry, guilt, and grief that had defined their relationship. He admitted the funeral decision was his greatest regret, not because it was objectively wrong, but because it revealed how damaged he'd been by his father's psychological warfare. He visited Meinhard's grave, decades late, and finally cried for the brother he'd lost twice, once to their father's manipulation, once to death. He also gained perspective on Gustav. His father had been a broken man wounded by war, trapped in a small town with limited opportunities, dealing with his own trauma by inflicting control on his sons. Gustav's cruelty wasn't personal, it was pattern repetition from his own damaged childhood. Understanding didn't equal forgiveness, but it created space for something beyond simple anger. The pattern broken. Arnold's greatest fear became replicating Gustav's mistakes with his own children. He didn't want to create competition between his kids. He didn't want to withhold love as motivation. He didn't want them feeling they had to achieve extraordinary things to deserve basic affection. But breaking generational patterns is harder than winning Mr. Olympia. Arnold struggled with presence, with emotional availability, with prioritizing family over career. The affair proved he hadn't fully escaped his father's legacy. He'd reproduced the emotional compartmentalization that had characterized Gustav's approach to family. Yet he also showed his children something Gustav never showed him: the ability to admit mistakes, to apologize, to keep trying even after failing. When Arnold's son Patrick, named after Meinhard's son, Arnold's nephew, struggled with his own identity and direction, Arnold didn't compare him to his siblings. He didn't manufacture competition. He tried imperfectly, but genuinely, to offer support without conditions. It wasn't perfect fatherhood, but it was better than what he'd received. The nephew, one of Arnold's most significant relationships, became the one with Patrick Knapp, Meinhard's son. After Meinhard's death, Patrick was raised by his mother Erika in Austria, growing up knowing his famous uncle primarily through movies and magazines. As an adult, Patrick reconnected with Arnold. The relationship was complicated. Patrick was a living reminder of the brother Arnold had lost and the funeral he'd missed. But Patrick was also innocent, a chance at redemption, a way to honor Meinhard posthumously. Arnold helped Patrick financially, maintained contact, tried to provide some version of the family connection Meinhard's death had severed. It wasn't the same as being there for his brother, but it was something. Patrick later spoke about the complexity of having Arnold Schwarzenegger as an uncle, the pride mixed with confusion about why Arnold hadn't been there when his father died. Patrick understood intellectually, but carried emotional questions that could never be fully answered. The legacy of death. Arnold's relationship with mortality became defined by those early losses. Meinhard's death taught him that life was brutally short and could end randomly, which reinforced his obsessive productivity. Why waste time? Why not achieve everything possible before death claims you too? But it also created a specific fear: dying with unfinished business, dying with people you love not knowing how you feel, dying with reconciliation forever out of reach. When Arnold faced his own near death during the 2018 heart surgery complications, he thought about Meinhard and Gustav. He'd spent decades trying to outrun death through achievement, and suddenly it had caught up anyway. All the trophies, all the movies, all the money, none of it had protected him from the same vulnerability that had killed his brother and father. The difference was that Arnold survived. And survival gave him something his brother and father never had: the chance to repair relationships before the end, to apologize to his children, to build connections based on authenticity rather than performance, to break the patterns instead of just understanding them. The unanswered question, the question that haunts Arnold's story: would Meinhard have survived if their father hadn't manufactured such toxic competition? If Arnold hadn't been driven to escape, would his brother have felt less trapped? Did Arnold's success cost Meinhard his life? The answer is unknowable, which makes it torturous. Arnold's therapist pointed out that Meinhard made his own choices: the drinking, the driving, the risks. Arnold wasn't responsible for his brother's death. But responsibility and causation are different things. Arnold's escape did change the family dynamics. His success did redefine what achievement meant, making Meinhard's conventional life seem inadequate by comparison. The favoritism reversal might have contributed to Meinhard's spiral. Arnold will never know for certain. Which means he'll carry the question forever. The survivor's code. What emerged from this trauma was something both powerful and damaged. Arnold's philosophy that achievement conquers everything, that willpower can overcome any limitation, that emotional vulnerability is dangerous weakness. This code worked spectacularly for career success. It drove him to become one of the most successful multi-domain performers in history. But it failed spectacularly for human connection. The same qualities that made him Mr. Olympia and Governor made him an emotionally distant husband and complicated father. The brothers Arnold and Meinhard represent two responses to the same damaged childhood. Meinhard internalized the damage and couldn't survive it. Arnold externalized the damage into relentless achievement and survived, but at significant cost to his emotional life. Neither outcome was healthy. One was just more successful. The final truth today, Arnold talks about his brother and father with something approaching peace. Not closure, these wounds don't close, but acceptance of their complexity. He acknowledges that Gustav's brutal parenting created both his greatest strengths and deepest weaknesses. That Meinhard's death shaped his entire approach to life, mortality, and achievement. That the missed funerals revealed truths about himself he'd rather not face, but can no longer deny. "I spent my life trying to prove my father wrong," Arnold said in a recent interview. "I wanted to show him that I could become somebody, that his favoritism of Meinhard was a mistake. And I proved it. But what was the cost? My brother is dead. My father died without us understanding each other. I built an empire on family trauma. The man who conquered bodybuilding, Hollywood, and politics couldn't conquer the ghosts of his childhood. He could only learn to live with them." The competition Gustav manufactured between his sons finally ended with one brother dead, the other carrying survivor's guilt for 5 decades. There was a winner, but victory was hollow. Arnold Schwarzenegger became extraordinary. But the price was paid by the people he left behind, especially the brother who stayed in Austria and slowly drowned in the life Arnold had escaped. The question remains, if you build an empire but lose your brother along the way, have you actually succeeded? Arnold still doesn't know the answer.